All right. Week 6, lecture number 5. Slowly we're getting all the information that we need to really, truly understand how that constraints-led approach can be applied. And that's why this week's lecture is termed Understanding the Dynamics of Skill Acquisition. It's going to take us... Oh, sorry. It's going to take us into the domain of performance changes and how we can see them over time. And that's going to be vitally crucial because I get questions from you, not just now, but before, as in how many videos do I need to take, how long do they need to take, and so on. And this will give you a little bit of a guideline on how you can visually interpret whether someone is acquiring a skill or not. We're going to specifically look at what happens if you want to change an old and preferred coordination pattern in an experienced learner. We're going to look at how the constraints-led approach deals with that. We're going to specifically look at sports coaches. We're going to look at physiotherapists. We're going to look at physical education specialists and how they might interpret the constraints-led approach. And then finally, we're going to look at how they use that to help clients, how they use that to help students and athletes. So first of all, we've said the basic premise of what we know so far is that motor coordination in these very complex systems result from the movement system settling into specific attractor states. And those attractor states we know we can all develop separately, whether that's in a drop kick towards the post or whether that's someone relearning how to walk. All of these skills are developed through developing attractor states. And we said last week, those attractor states, all of those attractor states together form the perceptual motor landscape. But the question is, now that we know how to develop attractor states, and we know that they develop through variation, through practice, through varying practice. Now that we know how attractor states develop, we still don't know how those attractor states are put together. It might be that someone who is juggling is very good at the attractor state of catching and throwing a ball with the right hand, very good at catching and throwing a ball with the left hand, but can't put it all together. And there's no real point of having those attractor states if you can't put everything together. Yeah, so skill acquisition does not only require really stable attractor states, it requires you to put all of those attractor states together in a wide perceptual motor landscape. So what needs to be done is once you develop those really stable attractor states, they have to be gradually changed so that all of them fit together in that perceptual motor landscape. That means that the way that you throw and catch that ball with one hand, and when you develop that attractor state, it's not going to necessarily transfer one-on-one to when you are juggling. And the throw of the ball is different, the timing is different, and so on. And in this week's lab, you will actually learn how to juggle. And I guarantee you that 90% of you will be able to juggle with 3 balls after the 1 hour or the first hour of that lab, because we're going to apply a constraints-led approach to learning. So for learning to occur, the learner must use the task that they're about to do as information that affords action. We've said that before as well. But to understand that, we need to talk about 2 major concepts. When someone is learning using the constraints-led approach, it's going to be very important that the intrinsic dynamics of the person really match the task dynamics. And what that means is, for example, if we are going to try and instruct a young child how to write with a pen, and that person is right-handed, then learning how to write with the right hand is going to be much easier, obviously, than learning how to write with the left hand. And that shows you that task dynamics, the writing with the right hand, have to match intrinsic dynamics, someone's right-handedness. Yeah, so that's the first thing that we have to understand. When someone acquires a skill, they have to have a certain aptitude for that skill. Doesn't mean they can't be a blank slate, but they have to have a certain aptitude. And we call that intrinsic dynamics. And those intrinsic and task dynamics, or the clash between them, are a really good way of explaining why such individual differences occur. In this week's lab, all of you will start out with the same practice while you're practicing juggling. And we will straight away see that some of you will pick that up straight away and will move to the next stage of learning, while some of you might need a much longer time to develop that very first stage. And that is because for some of you, the task dynamics match your intrinsic dynamics, and for some of you, they don't. Yeah, that doesn't mean you can't learn that skill, but it does show some sort of accelerated learning or explain some sort of accelerated learning in some individuals and why that doesn't occur in others. So as we said, a right-handed child will have difficulties learning how to draw left-handed, but that might not necessarily be so for a left-handed child. So task dynamics have to match intrinsic dynamics. And the second concept we need to explain is that with learning, not just the specific attractor states that you've determined are going to change, but the dynamic between those attractor states. And what I try to say, imagine that picture of the perceptual motor landscape from last week at the visual representation. That perceptual motor landscape, we said, consists of attractor wells, those deep grooves, attractor wells, and then those more flat parts. And what I'm trying to say is that as you train, those attractor wells become deeper. Yeah, they become more stable. But as one attractor well becomes more stable, another becomes more stable as well, or another becomes more shallow, and this one becomes more stable. And all that means is that skill acquisition is going to result in a very variable pattern, a very variable perceptual motor landscape. Yeah, so therefore, it's crucial that performers have a way of monitoring changes in the perceptual motor landscape, because us as practitioners, when we apply that constraints-led approach to someone's learning, we want to kind of have an idea after an hour, after 2 hours, after 3 hours, after 10 hours of practice, are they progressing in the right way? What is it actually that we're getting someone, or how is it actually that we're getting someone to change over time? I use that picture because we're going to try and explain changes over time with that picture later. To understand how you can visually witness skill acquisition when you use the constraints-led approach, we have to explain two concepts. One is symmetry, and one is functional equivalence. So remember the finger wagging experiment we did, or we talked about this year? We did it last year. Well, what Kelso, that researchers saw, that not only were those participants able to do the 90-degree phasing, but without practicing, they were also able to do a 270-degree phasing. So they basically acquired a skill that they never practiced before. And that shows you what we said before. It's not just the attractor state that you train, it's the layout of the whole perceptual motor landscape when you train one particular attractor. And that example of practicing in 90 degrees, developing an attractor state there, but also developing an attractor state at 270 degrees is called symmetry. And that is something that you can see over time, and we'll explain it with a backflip later. The second one, functional equivalence, is that phasing skill, the 90-degree and 270-degree phasing, that those participants learned over time, could not only be done by with the fingers, but also with the hands, the arms, the legs, and so on. That's called functional asymmetry, and we've called that, or we've termed that in motor control and learning, we've talked about a transfer of learning. So in other words, when you're observing someone practice with that constraints-led approach, you should be able to see symmetry, which is they are training one particular attractor state, but all of a sudden another one starts emerging as well. For example, you might have you might be training someone how to juggle a ball with the right foot, or no, with both feet. we would all agree that an important attractive state there would be to be able to juggle a ball with one foot, right? But as someone practices with one foot, all of a sudden an attractive state emerges for juggling with the left foot as well. They've never practiced it, but all of a sudden it emerges, the perceptual motor landscape changes, not just the attractor state. And so that shows symmetry. And all of a sudden, someone is also able to use that timing that they were using with the feet to juggle the ball with the head or with the shoulders. Functional equivalence. So the moment you see those things, symmetry and functional equivalence, you know that someone is slowly building those attractive states, slowly building a perceptual motor landscape. So what if you were to apply symmetry and functional equivalence to the acquisition of a backflip? How would we be able to see symmetry in someone backflipping? Let's say someone practices over and over and over again. When would you say, oh, I think that based on the constraint-led approach, this person is learning because I can see symmetry? Remember, this was symmetry, right? A new attractor state emerges, even though you don't train it. What is the attractor state you are training here? Yeah, it is the backflip, right? You're practicing it over and over again, preferably with variation and so on. And how would we see symmetry? What is the most important aspect here in landing a backflip? What is the most important aspect? Landing on your feet. And how do you land on your feet? High enough jump, but more importantly, because there's a human limit to the jump. Yeah, where's the technique in doing that backflip? In the rotation. Yeah? The faster you rotate, yeah, the easier it's going to be to land on your feet. All right, so tell me, this is attractor state of the rotation. How can you see symmetry? Or how can you measure whether someone has developed symmetry? Exactly, a front flip. Yeah, because it's important. Yeah, in that backflip, open up, close to get a faster rotation, a lot of inertia, little inertia, rotate, land on the feet. That is exactly the same way of using your body in a backflip or a front flip. So if someone improves their front flip performance while practicing the backflip performance, that is symmetry. What is functional equivalence? How would you know whether someone displays functional equivalence? You do a little test in between after the 10th hour of practice. Do they demonstrate functional equivalence? How would you know? What do you mean? Yes, but remember, we called functional equivalence, in this case, that particular skill could be done with the hand and feet as well. So how would we know? Yes, and what different environment particularly? You're definitely on the right track, but what specifically? Remember, we said the most important part of this skill is the rotation, right? If I want to show that rotation has some sort of variation, how can I manipulate how fast or how slow someone's going to rotate? Sorry? Yes, what she's landing on, but in this case, what does it have to be, the space where she's going to land? How can I give this person less time to rotate? Sorry? A harder, but more specifically, a higher. And we would agree if you give a higher surface, you have to rotate a lot faster. And that's functional equivalence. You change the height of the landing space by just 10 centimeters, they can still land, they demonstrate functional equivalence. And it's this type of shaping the performance environment that you have to slowly start understanding. Because in this particular example, and there are some of you who've talked to me about that, in this particular example, I'm the hands-off coach, right? What I'm going to do is, do a backflip. All right, that looks reasonably good. I'm going to put a mat there that is 10 centimeters higher. Or no, even better, I'm going to put a mat here that is 20 centimeters higher. I'm giving her more rotation time. I'm never telling her Okay? And there's going to be more rotation time. I'm creating the environment in which more rotation time affords a different sort of coordination. So she gets more time to work on that rotation. As that rotation becomes safer, she practices more and more and more. A more stable attractor state emerges. We take away the mat and we do the same thing again. Yeah, that's using the constraint set approach to measure, not measure, but to witness whether someone is progressing within the acquisition of a skill. All right? So, we've called our approach the constraints-led approach. When you read certain books, they're going to call that a constraints-led approach nonlinear pedagogy. And the reason why is because nonlinear pedagogy is a school and education term. And so a lot of this emerged from school environments where we would all agree, if you take a school environment rather than a sports club environment, the individual differences between pupils and schools are huge. And so there's a great benefit to applying a constraint-led approach. So sometimes it's called nonlinear pedagogy. And what that says is when you're trying to witness whether someone acquires a skill, before organizing into a new attractor state, the movement system experiences certain fluctuations. So in order to widen that attractor base, you need to practice with as much variation as possible. I'm coming back to here. If we just let this person practice that particular skill all the time, use a technique approach, just do the backflip as many times as you possibly can. We'll practice the first part, then the second part, third part, we'll put it all together, and you're always going to do this. That is likely not going to translate very well to a competition environment, where the environment might not be the same. Okay? If you're trying to do a backflip when you're coming off, what's the one called, I don't know, the thing they jump on? Vault? Yeah. So coming off the vault, you're going to need a different rotational speed than while doing it just a backflip while you're standing still. Same while you're moving, etc. So just training this particular backflip without any variation is not going to develop a really stable attractor state. It's going to develop a stable attractor state for doing that backflip exactly there exactly as it's shown, but not, for example, during competition. And so that's why we say that applying variability to learning is going to develop much more stable attractor states. Therefore, introducing constraints. Read, for example, giving someone more or less time to rotate in a backflip, and interpreting the system's ability to refine and adapt to those new constraints is going to be a hugely powerful tool for learning. What you need to read into that is when you are doing your skills project and you're trying to show me with the video over time that your performance is changing, a great way of doing that is introducing a new constraint and filming how your body at that point deals with the introduction of that new constraint. That's a great way of showing whether you're progressing, because we would all agree that even though you haven't introduced that particular constraint before, if you can deal with that constraint as it comes up now and you can deal with it well, that shows a much more stable attractor state for the particular skill that you're learning. So how would you assess? Let's say that someone would ask you, they filmed all their driving lessons, 20 hours of it, and they would ask you, do you think that I've progressed in driving a manual shift car? How would you do that based on what we saw so far? How would you measure? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, so in other words, you're introducing what? Yeah, a new constraint that they haven't seen before. Introduce a new constraint, look at the body's adaptability to that. Based on how well they adapt and how well they refine their skill in that particular situation, we can say that someone has acquired that skill to some extent, or someone has not. Yeah, does that make sense? How you can see progress over time? All right. So one thing that's obviously going to be important is short-term versus long-term changes. Short-term changes, usually when someone starts practicing and the perceptual motor landscape starts changing, all of a sudden you're building these, reasonably shallow but a little bit deeper attractor states for certain parts of the movement. But the question is, are we really training someone's capability to execute that same skill in the future? 5 years from now, 6 years from now, which is the bread and butter of skill acquisition. So more permanent behavioral changes need to take place than just the first ones that you see in training. Because after your 20 hours of practice, we said 20 hours of practice are great to develop some sort of perceptual motor landscape, but that perceptual motor landscape is not going to be hugely stable after 20 hours of practice. And so it's much more important to have behavioral change occur over time, so that you can practice more and continue to practice to continue to develop those attractor states. Therefore, when you do look at interpreting whether someone acquires a skill just by visual interpretation of how they deal with added constraints, it's very important that you look at whether those are not just transient effects. So you should repeat it more often. That doesn't mean you have to film it more often in your skills project, but let's say we add the constraint of driving in a very busy street. Doing it once, one-off performance or a one-off witness of that performance is obviously not a sign of learning. You have to introduce that constraint multiple times in a row and look at whether or not a behavioral change occurred or whether it was just a temporary change. So when we talk about how, this is how we interpret it. So there's 4 steps that are mainly used by those nonlinear pedagogists to interpret whether someone has actually acquired a skill or whether someone is on the right track to acquire a skill. And the first thing, and we've already done that, identify the significant constraints. Which constraints are likely going to influence this behavior, this coordinated behavior in the future, when they're going to do it in a real-life setting? You have to think about which constraints are going to be important. And second of all, usually when you practice with many people at the same time, let's say in a physical education class, we can look at what the effect is of introducing one of those constraints to to a separate subgroup of the group that we're looking at. So we can see how do people react when you introduce this new constraint. Then next, we're going to modify the degree and the frequency of introducing those constraints, just what I said before, looking at whether or not it's a transient or a behavioral change. And then finally, once we've introduced the constraint, we're going to also introduce movement variability. So we're not just going to drive on a busy city road where you can drive 50, but you're also going to drive on a busy freeway, or on a busy school zone, etc. So you're going to add variability to look at the stability of the attractor state that you just built under a certain constraint. So again, the same thing here. Let's say this is your physical education class, and the goal is for these students to be able to dribble the ball with both feet, alternating for 15 meters. What would be an approach you would take to developing that skill? Based on the 4 steps here. Identify significant constraints, changing the degree and frequency, and then movement variability. Dribbling a ball. What is a major constraint that acts on dribbling a ball? Size and shape of the ball. You don't just want them to be good dribblers with this specific ball. You want them to be able to develop some eye-foot coordination, whether they're dribbling with a tennis ball, a bigger ball, where eventually they might transfer it to a kick, at goal, in rugby, and so on. So an important constraint, let's say, is the size and the shape of the ball. How are you going to introduce that constraint? all right, so let's take a tennis ball. Yeah, we're adding a tennis ball to this. So first they do it a few times with a regular ball. We're adding a tennis ball. We see that slowly they are developing the same attractor state with the tennis ball than they did with the football. And so they're getting quite good at building an attractor state around the introduction of this new constraint. What is the last step? We said the last step is now you add movement variability. So what are we going to do now? We had the football, we added the tennis ball. So now what? We want them to be able to dribble with all types of balls. Yeah, get a bigger ball, smaller ball, dribble up with this ball, dribble back with the tennis ball, then with a different shape of ball and so on. Yeah? So we would all agree by now that if what we're trying to develop is someone's ability to control that ball in space, a good way to do that is to slowly add one constraint, look at the effect of that one constraint on performance, and then add movement variability. And in fact, and you might not have realized, but when I talk to most of you, that is exactly what you are doing. So instinctively, that is already what you know about skill acquisition. All right. So we've talked about the novice side of learning. Let's talk about the expert side of learning, because an important role for skill acquisition experts is how they deal with expert athletes. And now I'm lucky enough to work with expert athletes. There's not a lot of skill acquisition people out there that do, but it is very, very complex and very difficult to work with these expert athletes. Because with what you know from a constraints-led approach, what does the perceptual motor landscape of an expert athlete look like, regardless of the skill they do? Yeah, what does the perceptual motor landscape look like? The landscape with the attractor wells. It's very broad, that's one. And the attractor wells are very, very deep. And the deeper the attractor well is, the more stable it is. What do we know about a very stable attractor state? It is very hard to break. Very, very difficult. So the question is, what happens if one of those athletes comes to you and says, you know, the way that I swim is good, I'm getting good times, but I did some technique analysis, and I can clearly see that, you know, I'm not lifting my elbow first from the water, and I need a technique change. I need to break that really, really deep attractor state. And that happens when a learner is trapped in that deep attractor state. And we know that a very stable attractor state, even though it's very energy efficient and very economical, it might not be the most economical way to perform a particular skill. All of us would be able to swim 100 meters, but we'll all use different techniques, and all be different, or our economy in swimming would all be different. Okay? So what can we do to alter those movement patterns in experienced athletes? Let's take an example. Okay? This is a pole vaulter, and you are working with that pole vaulter. You know, and you're very happy in the beginning here. He started working, or she started working with you. I think it's, well, it might be she in this case. Yeah, 4.8. So she started working with you. In this case, you're very happy, progressing, great. All of a sudden, you see a small performance plateau. You're not too afraid because all of a sudden, progressing more and more and more. But here, there is no more progression. Okay? In other words, this person is stuck on a performance plateau. What are you going to do? Instinctively, what is your first, how do you think you can manipulate training to help them develop some sort of technique, yeah, so that they can break this plateau? Because we know that that's not the human plateau, 4.8 meters. Right. How are you going to progress? That is a really good suggestion, but these are expert athletes. Yeah, the performance gain you're going to get from that is minimal. Let's say, I'll give you a hint. Let's say the reason why this pole vaulter is not doing as well is because continuously in the vault, when going over the bar, feet are coming apart. How are you going to change their technique? So their preferred technique of having the feet come apart, is going to change. They're stuck in a really deep attractor state. And every time they jump, they don't think about it, but feet are separating. Feet are separating, core stability decreases, and they miss 3 or 4 or 5 centimeters.
So when they go over the bar, the feet are.
Yeah. So how are we going to change that? Sorry? What is adding variability going to do here? How are you going to add variability that will eventually result in 2 feet together? Yeah, very good. That's one thing. Yeah. Let's keep that in the back of our minds. Yeah. So what would you do? There's 2 major steps, and yours comes into play in one of those. Gradually weakening the stability of that really strong attractor state that they're caught in, and slowly moving to a new attractor state is usually the first thing people think of. Yeah? So practice with the same technique, but change their context or the variation of the run-up, or change the type of object they're jumping over, make them high jump instead of pole vault, etc. Things like that. Yeah? And really focus on holding those feet together. That's usually the first thing we think of. And the second thing is an extreme perturbation of the system. Yeah? This jumper has developed that attractor state where feet are always opening up. The best thing you can do is give them some way of keeping those feet together. And I've seen this before, where they attached Velcro to each side of the ankles. And while they were jumping, the person actually had to put the Velcro together, and in the landing, it was assessed whether or not the feet were together. Without instruction from the coach. And the coach just said, what I want you to do is I want you to do the same jump, but when you land, I want to see that both of your feet are Velcroed together. That's an extreme perturbation of the system. You're forcing someone to perform in a particular way to pull them out of that original attractor state and into a new one. What's going to happen to their performance? Drop, like, extremely. Yeah? Let's say tomorrow or next season, I continue at the Swans, and one thing that they ask is, we want to increase our goal-kicking percentage, right? The first thing that I always say is, well, do you want to first decrease it and then increase it afterwards? Because there is no other way. These are players that kick thousands of times per week or per month, in this case per month, thousands of times per month. Yep. There is no way I'm going to change their attractor state without first taking a few steps back. Let's think about this. Let's not imagine this is Djokovic, but let's say someone has a way of using a two-handed backhand stroke in tennis. But as a coach, you've analyzed that game and you think they would really benefit from a one-handed backhand stroke. We would agree that because of the amount of times that someone has hit a ball, that attractor state for a two-handed backhand stroke is going to be very, very, very stable. Okay? What are we going to do to make them hit with one hand? Yes, so how are you going to do that?
You're going to just focus on that the backhand system. You strap one hand.
Yeah, strap one hand, hold a tennis ball in one hand, only hit with the other. Yeah, for example, that's the perturbation of the system. What about the gradual decrease of the stability of that attractor state and the gradual increase of the stability in another? With your variation that you said, Larissa, how will you apply variation to this? We first have to think about what's the benefit of having a one-handed backhand stroke. Sorry? Faster and, more specifically, whether a ball bounces high or low, you can adapt to a much bigger range of different bounces of the ball and spins and whatever. So what do we have to show this athlete? What do you have to do to change this stable attractor state that's not always the most economical into something new? This is not Djokovic, let's say it's someone slightly less experienced. Sorry? All right, and how do we show them without instructing? How do you show someone what the benefit is of having a backhand stroke? Don't show them video. There's another way to do it. When is this person, highly experienced, going to change from a backhand to a two-handed backhand to a one-handed backhand? What is going to be the reason for it? When is this person going to say, oh yes, you know, you've shown me it's a much better way of doing it? Yes, but when do they know, like, yes, exactly, when they are performing better, right? So when do we just agreed that a one-handed backhand is going to perform better in a particular scenario than a two-handed backhand, right? We said when there's higher bounces of the ball and there's more variation in the amount of shots coming or the type of shots coming towards this player. How are you going to convince them without ever instructing them that a one-handed backhand might be better? Yeah, more variation in the balls gets older balls that don't bounce or that bounce higher or lower, get slightly different sizes and weights of balls, etc. Yeah, and by applying that practice variation, the backhand stroke is going to be slightly less successful over time. Of course, this doesn't happen in a day, but the two-handed backhand is going to be slightly less successful than the one-handed backhand, slowly decreasing the stability of two-handed backhand at attractive state, slowly increasing the stability of one-handed backhand. Yeah? Does that make sense? All right. So therefore, sometimes you need to take 2 steps back, yeah, to take a giant leap forwards. That means sometimes you have to sacrifice performance, yeah, to make a big increase in performance later. Trust me, I've tried. No coach buys this. Yeah? This is, you require a lot of weight to throw around before you can sell something like this to any coach. No one wants their athletes to decrease in performance. All right, so let's take a look at the practitioner perspective. Yeah? So we're going to quickly look at what do coaches do, what do physical education teachers do, and what do physiotherapists do, and do they already apply the constraints-led approach to learning? When we think about sports coaches, there's 2 main types. Yeah, there's experiential coaching and method coaching, or mechanistical coaching. When we think about experiential coaching, we think about someone like Laurent Blanc. Used to be a player, always played under the best coaches, and applies those coaches' principles to his players. The experiential coaching. On the other hand, there's something called method coaching or mechanistic coaching. And those are coaches that rely heavily on verbal communication of results, verbal feedback, very hands-on, always in their face, etc. For those of you who saw Disgraceful, by the way, Last Chance U, that coach, clearly a mechanistic coach. So there's 2 main types of coaches. And we know that, and I would encourage you, never adopt this last approach. If you have to use one of 2, go for experiential coaching. But what that means for us is that there are 2 types of coaches, but neither of them are very accustomed to skill acquisition practices. Some of them might use it instinctively, but a lot of them have never heard of practice variation. A lot of them would never sacrifice more errors for more benefit, more errors now for more benefit later on. Yeah, so a very important part of understanding how a constraints-led approach applies to sports coaching is to understand that a lot of coaches don't know anything about it at all. And we would agree that both of those approaches, whether that's experiential or mechanistic method coaching, both of those would benefit from applying a more constraints-led approach to skill acquisition. How about physical education teachers? Physical education teachers are the same. And there's a subset of teachers that use a very traditional approach. You do this now, you stand over there, you pass to this person, and this person is going to pass back to you. But there's also a new horde of physical education teachers that use that teaching games for understanding method. Yep. Where skills and decision-making are basically trained at the same time. Rather than telling someone to pass to someone else and then the other person to pass back, they're trying to train or they're trying to teach their pupils that within games, the best way or the easiest way to win is to pass to each other. And they create games in which you have no other opportunity to score than to pass to each other. And that's an entirely different approach to skill acquisition used by physical education teachers than the traditional approach. And that's the reason why, if you coach team sports, a lot of your trainers will be physical education specialists, or they might be teachers in other domains, because they understand that teaching games for understanding method. So the goal of teaching games for understanding is to emphasize the why rather than the how. Not how should I hold my foot to pass the ball exactly at a person standing there, but why should I use a particular pass with the inside of my foot when a person is standing very close to me? Why should I use a pass that's slightly off the ground when there's a potential that a defender might intercept that ball? And the why is much more important than the how in teaching games for understanding. And it is all about teaching games and skill and decision making within a game environment to give it purpose. That makes it more fun, gives it more purpose. So for example, in volleyball, a teaching games for understanding method, I've seen, let's say these are 7-year-old kids, right? Let's say between 6 and 8. I've seen volleyball coaches play volleyball with these children. We know that individual constraints and informational constraints don't allow those kids to intercept the ball with one touch, pass it to someone else. It's impossible. But a teaching games for understanding method would be that the ball is allowed to bounce on the floor first, then it is caught. Passed 3 times to someone else, thrown over the net, allowed to bounce on the floor first. So kids immediately can play, and immediately they can start to understand that, oh, when I position myself exactly underneath the ball, slightly bent over, on the tips of my toes, I can react faster to wherever the ball is going. No one is instructing them, but the teaching games for understanding approach is showing them that the best way to solve a movement problem is like this. And that's the difference between that traditional, do this now, stand like that, and hold your arms out, let the ball just fall on your arms. Whatever approach, traditional approach, and the teaching games for understanding approach. And I will actually pretend, and for whoever is here, it's difficult, but for whoever is not here, it's easy. I'll actually try to pretend you are 7 and 8-year-old kids in week 8, when I'm going to try and show you the teaching games for understanding approach to learning how to intercept objects in a volleyball specific manner. And you will see how that works. So teaching games for understanding, student-centered, and a high emphasis on the why, and the decision making. So we can skip over this pretty quickly, but basically teaching games for understanding, you need to know that that's what's usually referred to with a nonlinear pedagogy. And it originated in schools. A lot of schools are using it. During my whole university degree, and I got sick of it after a while, my whole university degree, all I was taught is to learn how to play soccer, basketball, badminton, whatever, using a teaching games for understanding approach. And I think it's important that at least you get an introduction to that through this subject. So, in any of these, or in any of these environments, where athletic coaches or sports coaches usually don't just have one single athlete, they usually have 10, sometimes 30. And for those of you who coach young kids, you know that sometimes you might have 12, 15, 20 kids at training. Having all those kids involved is very difficult. We would argue that if you use that traditional approach of pass to one person, then turn, and there's another person standing there, we pass to them, go to the back of the line, and wait until it's your turn, do the same thing over again. That is a traditional approach to coaching. But the teaching games for understanding approach would say, well, why don't we all just play 3 versus 1? We give the the attacking team a lot of time to pass the ball to each other. If they pass, they are more likely to score. And they are going to pass many, many more times in that scenario than they are going to in a scenario where they're standing across from each other. And on top of that, you're not just training skill, but you're also training decision making. If the defender is attacking me, I'm passing it to someone else. If the defender is not attacking me, I'm dribbling the ball forwards towards goal and I might try and score myself. That sounds simplistic, but it's a much better way of teaching kids how to deal with those scenarios, how to deal with manipulating constraints, because you can add an extra player, you can take an attacking player away, you can add an extra defender to get more time, but to get less time, but manipulating those constraints is going to train those attractor states of passing a ball. So you can you can think about this at home, about how you would go about encouraging the execution of a volleyball spike from a teaching games for understanding approach. And more importantly, as I said, and also you will be doing in your peer instruction session, coordinated behavior can emerge under almost no verbal feedback at all. So the best peer instruction sessions last year were those where there was minimal instruction during the session. So think about that when you're developing your own. Think about minimal instruction, and I hope that I'll be able to show you in week 8 what that looks like. All right. Let's take this one. Sorry. Yeah. Then rehabilitation and physical therapy. The benefit there, rehabilitation or physiotherapists, for example, usually work one-on-one. When you work one-on-one with someone, it is very tempting to give a lot of feedback and to use a very hands-on approach. But physiotherapists can use the same hands-off approach. They can use the same manipulation of constraints to have certain behavior emerge. And some physiotherapists do that very well. They're trying to get balance on one leg to emerge by putting someone on a non-stable surface. Not by telling them, oh, but you have to really try and contract these and these muscles in order to be able to balance the right way. No, they're creating the environment in which someone has no other choice than to act that particular way. But physical therapists usually use a facilitation approach. And so usually in the beginning, when certain behavior, coordinated behavior is risky, they might have certain behavior emerge where someone is really hands-on. Yeah? But the idea of a constraints-led approach is that after that initial hands-on phase, and everything is safe, add as many constraints as possible. Stop the hands-on approach, stop the verbal instruction, but create the environment. Be a much smarter skill acquisition specialist than the old school ones that are always on Twitter telling you how to coach young kids. Yeah? Be a lot smarter about it, create the right environment. Same thing for physiotherapists. Hands-on approach first, but gradually taking that hands-on approach away and more hands-off. Create the environment in which someone has to coordinate particular behavior exactly right, or the task fails. Because eventually what you want is you don't want someone who can only ascend these stairs when you're standing right next to them, or when the stairs are perfectly smooth and dry. You want someone who can deal with a lot of variation, who's developed a really stable attractor state that regardless of which constraints act upon them in the real world, they can meet those constraints head on and they can still execute coordinated behavior. So in summary, we said that practitioners play a variable role in how that constraints-led approach is delivered. And I hope that at least 50% of you who are in coaching go out there and actually try this and see the benefit of using that constraints-led approach over the traditional approach that you've been taught. Those of you going to coaching education, talk about the constraints-led perspective for learning, not just the traditional approach. Replicating a technique doesn't work because it doesn't allow you to meet constraints. There's an important rule for variation, which we already talked about. And it is vital that practitioners in any field, education, sport, rehabilitation, or clinicians, pediatric clinicians, and so on, know how to manipulate constraints and which behavior to expect after manipulating those constraints. All right, that's it for this week. If you have any questions, please outside. I've got some meetings with some of you until 11:45, right? All right, I'll see you outside if you need me.